Hey everyone, I'm just going to give everybody a few minutes to get organized and join, and then we will go ahead and get started. Hey everyone, looks like people are still joining, so I'm just going to give it a few minutes for everybody to join. One of the things they wanted me to point out was they, as part of the conference, they're giving away Amazon gift cards. So I think they have 40 or something Amazon gift cards to give out to people. So check your email and you might be a lucky winner. Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll let people just join in whenever. So just quick format for this. This is going to be an introduction to penetration testing and red teaming. We're going to basically cover the difference between a penetration test and a red team engagement, as well as the difference between a penetration test and a vulnerability scan. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions and a few different examples of different penetration tests that I've performed in the past, hopefully to make it a little bit more interesting. In general, I had planned originally for this talk to be approximately 30 minutes long, and found out that it's an hour and a half. So we have plenty of time for questions or anything else as we're going through this. I guess the easiest way to do that is just drop it in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, and Kyle can my colleague Kyle's on the phone, and he can keep me accountable if I forget to check the chat every once in a while, and I'll definitely at least check it at the end. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So first and foremost, a little bit about me. So I am a principal security engineer at Triaxiom Security. Triaxiom Security is an information security firm based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. We partner with clients, everything from Fortune 300 here in Charlotte, all the way down to 3-person startups in Silicon Valley and really everything in between. So as part of my job at Triaxiom Security, I get to perform penetration tests on a myriad of clients across almost every different industry vertical you can think of. So one day I might be performing penetration tests for hospitals, and the next would be, a SCADA type assessment for electrical co-op in South Carolina, whatever it may be. My background, I went to the Air Force Academy, and then from there I commissioned as an officer in cyberspace for the Air Force. That was a blast. I spent 3 years in England. So when I was stationed over there, I was part of the Special Operations Group. And my job was to be a tactical communications officer. So they would essentially drop us off in a field, and we would set up networks for about 1,000 people within the first 12 hours of us hitting the ground. That was a lot of fun. My wife and I went to 32 countries while we lived there, had a blast. After that, I got stationed in Hurlburt Field, Florida, which is on the Panhandle. Awesome place to live. As part of that job, I was part of the Air Force's operational test and evaluation. So my job was to perform cybersecurity evaluations and make sure things are good to go from a cyber perspective prior to the Air Force buying and putting something in the field. So as part of that, I performed cyber evaluations on things such as the air defense system over Washington D.C. and Los Angeles, as well as a lot of, pretty cool things. After that, it looked, all signs were pointing towards the Air Force sending me to be in charge of a help desk in Minot, North Dakota. So I said, time for me to get out. And since then, I've been doing penetration testing for several companies, but most currently at Triaxiom Security. So education, Air Force Academy, like I already mentioned, I got my master's from Virginia Tech. Too many certifications to keep track of at this time. Just recently started dabbling in capture the flags. Carolina Con was one of my first ones, and I won the wireless capture the flag with some of my colleagues and friends. And then additionally, B-Sides Knoxville was my most recent one. So just started getting into that. It's a lot of fun if you have not done capture the flags before. Not really a true indication of penetration testing per se, because a lot of things are, you're not going to encounter crypto challenges or anything like that in a real world penetration test. Twitter handle, if you want to follow me. I'm really not very good at Twitter, so I'm trying to get better at it though. All right, so overview, like we already talked about, really what we're going to start with is what is the difference between a vulnerability scan and a penetration test. Really that's a pretty obvious answer, and we'll get into that, but it's surprising to me how many people don't understand that and how many times I'm in a conversation with somebody and it's clear that, so I wanted to clear the air with that before. Then we'll go into the different types of penetration testing. And once we do that, we'll switch gears and talk about what red teaming is and the pros and cons of red teaming. And then finally, we'll talk about how to get into penetration testing if you are interested in that. So with that being said, this workshop is really, oriented towards those who are interested in penetration testing, either because you think it might be good for your organization and you're trying to figure out, hey, what's the right type of pen test I should be looking for, or two, this calls for you if you're interested in possibly pursuing penetration testing as a career field and want to know, what's the good and bad about being a penetration tester. Really what this call is not meant for is if you already know everything about penetration testing and you are a penetration tester, this will be a pretty boring talk for you. So as I already mentioned, but for those who just joined, if you have any questions at any point, just throw them in the chat and I'm happy to answer those. So jumping right in then, what is the difference between a vulnerability scan and a penetration test. So first and foremost, a vulnerability scan is an automated scan of your network for common vulnerabilities. So essentially, you can buy a vulnerability scanner off the shelf. You know, there's a bunch of different brands of it. The picture here is Nessus Professional. But essentially, what that does is it scans your network and it fingerprints all the different services you have listening on the network. And it tries to discern if there's any vulnerabilities associated with those. So for example, it may grab the banner of your SSH server and realize you're running you know, a particular version of OpenSSH, and then it will use its own database and see if there's any vulnerabilities associated with the banner that your SSH is reporting. If it does, it'll report it as a findings. So advantages of vulnerability scans is it's relatively cheap. You know, to buy a Nessus Professional license for you to use as part of your organization is about, you know, $2,000. Now you need to know how to do it, but you can get a third party to help you with it for just a little bit more than that. It's really is cheap. Additionally, it's automated, so you can use it frequently. One of the most common uses of vulnerability scans would be every time you change a network in any significant way or update a system. So for example, if your organization has a particular web application and every time your developers push a new patch to the system or a new update to the application, you should go ahead and run a vulnerability scan just to make sure there's nothing changed or there's no new vulnerabilities associated with it. The cons of a vulnerability scan are it can cause problems on the network. So generally speaking, you know, like I mentioned, this is going out and scanning your entire network, and it's fingerprinting all those hosts, and it's checking for common vulnerabilities against every system in your environment. 9 times out of 10, when we're performing penetration tests and there's a problem that comes up from our test, it's because of the vulnerability scan itself. It just hogs a lot of bandwidth. It's touching every single port of every single system. And, you know, even with denial of service type tests turned off, it can still cause problems on your network. The main problem, though, is the fact that there's a lot of false positives. So when you get a vulnerability scan, like we talked about, it's basically just trusting whatever banner is presented to it, or sometimes it'll look for different timing characteristics to identify versions, etc. But it's using its fingerprinting algorithm to try to figure out what version of software, what version of operating system, etc. you're running, and then making decisions based off its database from that. As a result, if you have backported security patches or your system is just configured a little bit differently, you're going to run into a lot of false positives. It's just doing a best guess. And then finally, vulnerability scans are going to miss a lot of the major security vulnerabilities that are going to be used in a penetration test or a real-world attack. You know, throughout the rest of this presentation, we're going to talk about some of the different penetration tests I've performed. In almost every single example, and I think every single example, not a single one of them would have been caught by a vulnerability scan. So, you know, generally speaking, thank goodness it's getting more and more rare as a penetration tester to see those really old systems. We do see them, but for exploitable vulnerabilities and that kind of thing, more and more it's the stuff that's not going to be caught by a vulnerability scan are what attackers are using to exploit their permissions on the network or gain unauthorized access, etc. Additionally, you know, ransomware, etc., is using vulnerabilities that are not necessarily found in vulnerability scans. So keep that in mind. Penetration test, by contrast, is an ethical hacker trying to break into your network. So this is quite literally you hire someone who's trained in performing tests, and engineers, what we call them at Triaxiom Security. Some people call them security consultants, some call them penetration testers, whatever it is. You will hire them, and they have a set period of time or a set IP address scope, and they are trying to break in through your network. They are using automated and manual attempts. So what do I mean by that? Well, when I'm doing a penetration test, my penetration test always will consist of a vulnerability scan. So when I'm performing a penetration test, I'm not necessarily trying to find one way to capture the flag or to gain complete access to your network. I'm trying to find all of the various ways I may be able to find access to your network. And so because of that, I'm going to use a lot of automated tools, scans, vulnerability scans, tools that will enumerate websites, etc., with the attempt of giving me full coverage so I can know everything about the network. We'll talk a little bit later about red team might not have as much automated because I'm trying to avoid detection, but in a penetration test itself, I'm trying to find all the vulnerabilities an attacker might use, so I'm going to leverage tools when I'm able to do some automated. With that said, penetration tests will include a lot of manual attempts. Different things I'm doing manually, trying to check for SQL injection, manually trying weak passwords, etc. One of the characteristic differences between a penetration test and a vulnerability scan would be in a penetration test, we actually exploit the vulnerabilities I found. So if I find this MS17010 that you see on the right here, this critical finding, I may actually try to exploit that in a penetration test. Why? Well, first and foremost, that helps me to weed out false positives, whether this is actually an exploitable vulnerability or if it's just a fingerprint that thinks you're running, missing that security patch, and therefore you're vulnerable to it. The second reason why is because that last bullet there, it demonstrates the risk. It's hard for you as a security person, as a blue teamer, or whatever it is, to be able to prioritize what fixes you need to make. Obviously, vulnerability scans do a good job. I separated them into critical, high, medium, or low. But generally speaking, when you get up to the management level and you're trying to get organizational buy-in as well as the resources necessary to make changes, it's very difficult to say, hey, we have 3 critical vulnerabilities, because over time that becomes the boy who cries wolf, right? So every time you go up to the management and say, hey, we have critical, this is critical, this is critical, generally as security practitioners, we say that too often, and therefore it loses its effectiveness. Now, with that being said, if you have a penetration test report which shows the CEO's computer or some sensitive files on your network that a hacker was able to get to, that's going to get you to organizational buy-in a lot better. So generally speaking, a penetration test will let you know whether you can sleep well at night or not. Now, in this particular example, MS17010, just for those who know that that is, we typically do not exploit that unless we have to on a penetration test. So the reason for that is that particular vulnerability, if it works, gives me complete control over the Windows system that's running that's missing that security patch. That's awesome. However, 50% of the time will result in a blue screen of death. So this is one of those vulnerabilities where I'll keep it in my back pocket, and if it's a user workstation or something that's not critical, then absolutely I'll try to exploit it. But if that is running on a server, I'm going to try to avoid it because that's likely going to cause an issue on the network. Which brings up another good point. In a penetration test, I'm trying to do everything I can to give you a good understanding of the risk of your network while also keeping the network operational. So really, I'm trying to avoid anything that might cause problems. Now, some of the cons of a penetration test is cost and time. So generally speaking, a penetration test is way more expensive than a vulnerability scan. Why? Because you have to have an engineer dedicated for a set time period to do this. Additionally, there's usually time involved. So for an example of an external penetration test, there's meetings to get the rules on the same page with the rules of engagement. Then we may start the test. The test may last a week. Then we have to do documentation and an internal QA process, and then we have to go over the report together, right? Vulnerability scan, typically that would take a day. So there's time in there. Additionally, penetration tests can cause problems on the network, exceedingly rare. Like I mentioned earlier, it's usually the vulnerability scan that causes the problems on the network. And if you have an experienced penetration tester, for the most part, they can avoid that. Now, with that being said, the obvious exception, if there's a really old system and we're not made aware of it, or something that is severely misconfigured, then it is, of course, always possible for something to go wrong during a penetration test. So with that being said, what do I recommend, a vulnerability scan or a penetration test? Well, the answer there is both. There's a time and a place for both vulnerability scans and penetration tests. Most industry standards would recommend you do quarterly vulnerability scans and then an annual penetration test. The reason for that is vulnerability scans are cheap and automated, and you can just run them once a quarter to make sure nothing significant has changed, but really it doesn't take the place of a penetration test. So if you're doing that once a year with quarterly vulnerability scans, that's the best of both worlds right there. All right, switching gears to the different types of penetration testing. So first is the external penetration test. So essentially, an external penetration test is trying to answer the question, can a hacker on the internet break into my network? And so really we're emulating, and I'm just going to go ahead and switch to the next page here. An external penetration test is exactly, that. We place a laptop on the outside, just on the internet, and we have different testing systems that we have set up that basically just allows us to do this type of testing. And it's very similar to, can a hacker in China break into my system? So can we gain unauthorized access to your servers in scope? Can we gain access to the internal environment? Our ultimate goal is to find a way to gain internal network access. Generally speaking, organizations spend a lot of time and resources securing their perimeter. However, if we are able to find a way to get into the internal network, it's usually very easy for us to escalate to take over the entire network. And by that, I mean get domain administrator permissions, which of course gives me permission to every Windows system in the environment. So how do we do this? So external penetration test is going to include open source reconnaissance. So we're searching Google for anything that should not necessarily be there. I've seen everything from sensitive Excel files that have salary of users posted that they didn't know was posted. I've also seen it where help desk engineers are having a problem with the firewall, so they go to a particular IT forum and say, hey, I'm having trouble with this, and then they load the configuration. And so I can just steal the firewall configuration right from there. So open source reconnaissance is really just, using the different search engines and specially crafted Google searches to see if I can find anything that I perhaps should not see about the organization. Additionally, we're going to look at all the 65,000 TCP ports or the top UDP ports to make sure to find exactly what isn't, what's listening on the internet. One of the things we do at Triaxiom that I really like is in our reports we give basically an appendix to say, hey, here's your attack surface, and it lists every single system and every single port that we found on those systems listening. And really what this does is it helps the IT administrators on the other end, look at this compared to what they were expecting to see if everything there was, if everything there is expected. Now, I just brought up a term that I want to elaborate on a little bit more. Attack surface is a really big, term for basically for you to understand. It basically means the more ports and services that you have exposed, the more avenues I have as a penetration tester to gain access to your network. So if you really think about it like a castle, if you have a giant moat around your organization and the only way in is your VPN, with multi-factor authentication, it's almost guaranteed I'm not going to be able to get in through for my external penetration test. With that being said, if you have more doors, back doors for, oh, we have to have an FTP server, oh, we have to have our email exposed, we have to have X, the more different things that your organization has exposed, the more avenues I have as an attacker to try to attack that. So that's kind of just a key concept there. Like I mentioned, we do a full vulnerability scan, manual and automated exploit attempts, and then finally password attacks. So let's jump into kind of a very common finding that I find when doing external penetration tests. So let's say I'm doing an external penetration test, and I've just recently have done this against different organizations. One of them is a major equipment rental organization, and one would be a hospital in a northwestern state. So I'm doing this penetration test, and I come across this Microsoft single sign-on portal. And so what this is immediately tells me is this is perfect for a password spraying attack. So traditionally, when you're considering a password attack, you're considering, let me try the username admin, and I'm going to try password 1, password 2, password 1, 2, 3, trying thousands of passwords against the username admin. Well, a password spraying attack reverses this paradigm. So instead of doing 1,000 passwords against one username. Instead, I'm going to do 1,000 usernames against one password. So how do I do that? Well, let's go to LinkedIn and let's find as many different employees as I can find. So like I just said, I recently did this against 2 fairly large organizations, each with over 1,000 employees. So LinkedIn had 800 employees associated with it. So great, scrape all their names. Next, I need to find their email convention. So generally speaking, this just takes a few Google searches to try to find anything at Acme. Of course, Acme is just a fake company. I'm not allowed to say who the actual company is. But let's just do a search on Google for @acme.com. Well, great. Now I see that it's first.last@acme.com. Great. So now I can just take those LinkedIn usernames and put them in that convention, joe.smith@acme.com. Perfect. Now let me try one very common weak password against all of the different usernames I just collected. And so one common username may be, password will be summer 2020. Why is this so common? Well, generally speaking, in about, I would say somewhere around 60% of the companies we perform tests on, that'll be a password right now. Why is that? Well, organizations are trying to increase their password security and follow best practices, and they're requiring users to change their passwords every 90 days, and they're requiring them to be complex and meet certain complexity and length requirements, etc. So no doubt, half of you have tried to type in passwords and it keeps getting denied and denied and denied, and you get frustrated. Well, an easy way to get around that would be you set your password as summer 2020, and then guess what? 90 days from now, you set it to fall 2020. Then we have winter 2020, spring 2021, etc. So many organizations are following that it's really, that's a very common one. Another common one right now would be like COVID-19 or COVID-19 or quarantine sucks. Really, those passwords are going to be all over the place because they're meeting complexity requirements. They're easy to remember. And, you have to imagine that people aren't putting forethought into their passwords. They're just choosing them when their password expires, and they have to do it real quick before they can log into their computer, so they're just picking something easy. So what does this look like? So this is what it looks like. This is a password spraying attack. The tool that I'm using here is Burp Professional, and what it allows me to do is just repeat web traffic over and over again. The most common place where I use this tool, Burp Professional, would be web application penetration tests that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But really, you can use it for password sprays as well. So the payload in this instance, and I blurred them out because this is from an actual test, but the payloads here are that john.doe@acme.com, jane.doe@acme.com, john.smith@acme.com, etc. So this is the 1,000 different usernames. And in the request, I've already specified the password, and I'm trying to log into their single sign-on portal. So I'm repeating this, thousands of times, and I'm looking for any differences in the responses. So you can see from the highlighted one here at the top, first of all, it's a 302, and second of all, the length field is way different. So that indicates to me that there's something different about this request. Well, what's different is that's a valid set of credentials. So great, now I have a valid set of credentials. What can I use that for? Well, first and foremost, I log into the OWA or their email accounts. With that being said, once you're in the email account, that's great, perfect, what can I do? Well, what most people don't realize is that attackers do the same thing that you do when you're in your email. I'll just use that little search field at the top, and I'll search for things like Visa, MasterCard, password, etc., to try to give me, juicy stuff. I'll also search for VPN and maybe get some different, VPN, in case your IT department sent out a VPN type of, email to people saying, hey, here's how to log into VPN or whatever it is. In this particular instance, this is from an actual penetration test. We found that they switched their credit card machine. So the new password for the credit card machine is now blank. Well, perfect. Now I can just walk into the store and type that in and gain access to the credit card machine. In other organizations, I've seen everything from healthcare data being sent across to social security numbers to sensitive HR emails talking about salary. You name it, and I've seen it in email. including I saw somebody literally had a draft of their 2-week notice. They're about to quit their job. So sometimes you encounter things that are a little bit awkward, but that's neither here nor there. Next thing I'm going to do, again, the main purpose of an external penetration test is to try to gain unauthorized access to the internal network. First place I'm going to go is to the VPN. Now, one of the ones we recently talked about was the major hospital in a northwestern state that I just recently did this penetration test for. When I logged into their VPN, I got hit with a duo code. Essentially, they were trying to do, dual multi-factor authentication. So for those who don't know, multi-factor authentication is a combination of two of the following. So something you know, which is your password, something you have, which in most cases these days is a push notification to your phone or a one-time code on your phone. The third could be biometrics like a fingerprint or iris scan or something. Those are exceedingly rare. But essentially they had multi-factor authentication on their Cisco AnyConnect Secure Mobile. Great job. So first of all, that's one of our prime recommendations for when we're doing this external penetration test with game access. So, great job there. Unfortunately, what you'll know is there is no such thing as a silver bullet when it comes to security. So, unfortunately, for this particular test, there was also social engineering. We were approved to do social engineering as well. So, I had access to the user's email because that wasn't connected with multi-factor authentication, but their VPN was. So what I did was I called the help desk, posed as John.Doe, and had them reset my multi-factor authentication, which of course went to my email. I added the new configuration, and off I went. I was connected to the internal network. So with that being said, obviously there is no silver bullet. Even multi-factor authentication can only get you so far. Switching gears. And again, if there's any questions at any point, just throw them in the chat. I don't think I see any so far. So cool. All right, internal penetration test. So once an attacker gains access to my network, once I get past that VPN, like we just talked about, what damage can be done? What's also important about an internal penetration test is not only once an attacker gains access, but it also explores the risk of an insider threat. So if you have a employee that knows they're about to get terminated in 2 weeks or knows you're about to downsize and just wants to cause as much damage as possible, what can be done? Or if you have somebody, trying to skim the system, whatever it is. So it also explores the insider threat. So on an internal penetration test, our start point is right here. So where do we place this laptop? So, well, first of all, on an internal penetration test, we're going to send a laptop to our client and have them connect it to their internal network. So we don't have any network credentials. We don't have any, privileged access or anything. There is a form of internal penetration test, which is called assumed compromised, where you would basically assume that Sally from marketing or whoever it is clicked on a link they shouldn't have, and so therefore you have access to their user credentials, and you can start from there. We like to start a step back from that and basically just put our laptop on the network, and we'll go from there. So why do we put our laptop? Really just because it saves us time. We have all of our preloaded tools on there, etc. And then really what this also emulates the threat of is 1, somebody gained access to the VPN, 2, insider threat, or 3, we'll talk about physical penetration tests in just a minute, but maybe somebody walked in off the street and planted a laptop on your network because you don't have port authentication or whatever it is. So in an internal penetration test, I'm going to attack laterally, and then additionally, I'm going to try to escalate my privileges to that of a domain administrator and gain access to the server networks, whatever it may be. Okay, so on an internal penetration test, once we're connected to the internal network, there is a whole range of options that would not be available to us on the external. So as I already mentioned, generally speaking, external perimeters are really locked down, and organizations spend a lot of time and resources making sure those are locked down accordingly. Internal network, first of all, there's not as much attention paid to it. Additionally, I'm no longer seeing that attack surface we talked about with the number of ports and services goes up exponentially. You're using firewalls to block what services are exposed to the internet. On the internal network, that's not the case. So I'm seeing, all sorts of ports open that I would not be able to see on the external. Third and foremost, there's all sorts of local attacks that I can do when I'm connected to the same subnet as you that I would not be able to do otherwise. So the most common type of attack I can do on an internal penetration test would be what's called NetBIOS name server and local link multicast name resolution spoofing. So this one's a little bit technical, but bear with me. If you are running a Windows environment, your Windows computer, when it's trying to connect to a server it hasn't connected to before, will go through the following steps. So let's say that you're trying to connect to a file on a file server, and instead of doing file server 01, you accidentally mistype it, and it's typo file server 01 or whatever. Your Windows computer is going to first, it's going to check its local host file. Your local host file is just a file on your computer of every system you've talked to recently. So of course you mistyped it in this instance, so it's not going to be there. Step two is it's going to reach out to the, excuse me, it's going to reach out to the DNS server. And so the DNS server is really just the phone book of your internal network. Hey, do you know where typo file server 01 is? Of course, in this particular instance, it doesn't know where typo file server 01 is because you mistyped it. So step two there is sorry, not found. Windows computers by default will do step three here, which is basically it will send that broadcast out to the entire network. So again, on this scheme, it would basically be the entire line here by the switch. Saying, hey, does anybody know where typo file server 01 is? Now, it'll send these out as two different things. First is a local link multicast name resolution, and then second would be a NetBIOS name service request. And so it'll send these out to the entire network, and what that allows me to do as an attacker is say, hey, yes, that's me, and then in step 5, I'm going to get whatever is next in the process. Now, in most instances, let's say you're trying to connect to a web server, step 5 is just going to be a get HTTP request, right? You're just trying to access the website, and unless I'm listening and trying to present a website, I'm not going to be able to use anything for it. However, if you're trying to access a file server, every time you're trying to access a file server over the network, you need to prove you have access to, accounts.xls. So basically, the way that works is a challenge response protocol. So you'll reach out to me and say, hey, I want to access, accounts.xlsx. And I'll say, great, prove to me you're able to see this, and I'll send you a challenge, 112233. You will take that challenge and combine it with your hashed or encrypted password and respond back to me in what's called challenge response protocol. And so what that looks like is this. So basically, this user, and again, I need to blur out a lot, sorry about this, but this user was trying to reach out to me over, for a, LLMR request. And so what it looks like is I sent them the challenge 1107F7E30, and then they responded to me with all this. Now, this is all encrypted, hashed traffic, cannot really do anything for it. But what that allows me to do is now I have that password offline. And so really quickly explanation of the difference between an online and offline password attack. In an online password attack, for example, in that password spraying attack we went over just a minute ago against the single sign-on portal, I am limited by the speed of the network. So every time I'm trying to password, I'm sending john.doe@acme.com across the network to wherever this hospital is. Their server is processing that request and then sending me back an invalid. So at best case scenario is I'm doing about 4 to 5 different password guesses a second. Additionally, I'm going to run into things like account lockouts. If I do that, if I tried, that same username and 3 or 4 passwords, it's probably going to lock out the account. Now, password spraying is one of the effective ways to get around that because it results in only 1 invalid attempt per user, but I'm still going to likely get noticed. I can only do that so often. Really, what that means is I'm limited to about 2 attempts per 30 minutes, right? But if I full throttled it 4 to 5 guesses per second would be my max. In an offline password attack, now that I have your hash here and I can take that offline, I'm not limited by any of that anymore. So first of all, there's no account lockout. Second of all, there's no way you're going to be able to know the password attempts I'm doing because I'm doing an offline crack in my own machine. And then three, I'm no longer limited by the speed of the network. Rather, I'm limited by the speed of my computer. So at Triaxiom, we basically set up a computer with 4 GPU units, very similar to Bitcoin, data mining, etc. And that can do 30 billion password guesses per second. So let's put that into perspective. If your password is 7 characters long, we can brute force it, which basically means trying every combination of capital, lowercase, numbers, digits, etc., every possible combination of 7 characters in 45 minutes. 8 characters, 2 days. And really, we're doing other things like, trying dictionary words, using rules to change the A's to ats, S's to dollars, O's to zeros, adding 1, 2, 3 at the end, adding exclamation points at the end, etc. And so that's really the difference between an offline password attack. So back to this internal penetration test, we're kind of fictitious internal pen test we're walking through. Through this NDNS and LMR, we got a few hashes offline, and we took those offline, and we were able to crack those. So that basically gave us access to that system. Now, good for us, that organization, by the way, most organizations do, have their users as local administrators on their computers. Only their own computers, but that's enough for us for now. So essentially, what that means is now I can basically quickly exploit it and get, using their own password, and because they're the local administrator, I can quickly get system level access on the system. So system level is basically top level access. Essentially, once you have admin rights, you can quickly switch to system rights. It's just switching to a process that's running a system. So with that being said, we now have access to one system in our local subnet that we were able to access from this type of attack. Now, once I have system level access to a system, I can just dump contents of memory. So the first thing I'm going to dump is the local SAM file. And so this basically hosts the hashed passwords for all of the local accounts on the system. So you might have a local administrator, et cetera, and then everybody else logs in through the domain. In this particular instance, these are still hashed passwords, and again, that just basically is a one-way form of encryption. But these are hash passwords. There's a major difference between this hash password and the previous one I showed you, though. This hash password does not follow that challenge response that I talked about earlier. So remember in the last one I said, hey, I want to access this. Great, prove to me you have access. Here's your challenge, 112233. And then you would combine that with your hashed password to give me the challenge response. And that makes it so that that response can only be used if I get that exact same challenge again, which is set to be randomized, so there's no way I would get that challenge again. In this example, this is the hash password before the challenge response. So no matter what the challenge I get from any system I'm trying to authenticate at, I can use this hash password in combination with that to get the correct response. Essentially what that means is I can use that in what's called a pass the hash attack. In a pass the hash attack, I gain access to everywhere that same local administrator account is being used. So basically here you can see the green indicates that that same password is in use, and now I have access to that system, and then the red would be no. So it's not every system, but it's quite a lot of systems on the network. And just like that, I'm now able to gain access to a bunch of them. Well, now that I have access to a bunch of different servers, I'm going to try to do something called wdigest. So again, once I have system level access, I can dump the contents of memory. Another particularly interesting part of memory, if your settings are not set correctly, is wdigest. Wdigest is basically a way for Windows computers to make life easier on you. You don't want to have to type in your password every time you try to go to a website, especially one you recently went to. So it basically is a clipboard in memory that stores your password in clear text. Well, let's say I do this against a server. the only people who have recently logged into a server are most likely IT people, and so therefore that's what I'm going to target this against. And because that local administrator password was the same, now I just dumped this, I got clear text passwords from it, and just like that, I'm a domain admin because I stole their password from clear text out of memory. Once, as a penetration tester, this is my ultimate goal, to get domain administrator. But once I get that, showing this to the CEO or the board of a company is not going to generate the change that I'm trying to help my client achieve. So with that being said, the next thing I do is let's use those to demonstrate to the client some of the risk associated with us getting domain administrator. So maybe I'm going to go into this shared drive for the company and use my domain access and try to gain access to sensitive things. Maybe I can find a list of every user, and here is the, whatever, vice president salary right there. Finally, maybe I can find sensitive financial information. So this is information about what they're forecasting their stocks to be at for a publicly traded company. So obviously something like this would get the attention of the board very quickly. All right. It doesn't look like I have any questions so far, so moving on. Another type of assessment is a social engineering assessment. So generally speaking, this is, will my employees click a link or provide information that may jeopardize my company? So there's really a lot of different types of social engineering. Generally speaking, when I'm doing awareness training for a company, what I find is that most organizations still consider the Prince of Nigeria type email where you get, hey, some wealthy person in Nigeria wants to send you a bunch of money and they have to send it through your account. When we're considering sophisticated social engineering attacks, it really, really most users aren't exposed to them and therefore completely unaware that they're possible. So at Triaxiom, we generally do 3 different types of social engineering attacks for an organization, depending on, of course, what their needs are. But the first is phone-based or phishing. So we may set up a fake portal. So what most organizations don't realize is, you can, let's say, going back to our original example, Acme is your company name, and your domain is acme.com. Well, I can go to Google Domains and buy acme.training for $12 a year. From that, I can just set up for another $6, I can set up a help desk at acme.training email address. Then I can go on LinkedIn and find somebody in your IT department and copy their email signature. And then I can figure out through a more open source Reconnaissance what their phone number is. Oh, sorry, I have a question here. So do you have any specific devices like laptops only for pen test on-site for clients? So in general, that's about an internal penetration test. Is there a specific device I send? No. So in general, at Triaxiom, we base ours off of Kali is our general operating system, and we have a lot of specially crafted tools and scripts on top of that. We send just Dell laptops. Sometimes, depending on the client, especially if we're doing a cloud-based internal penetration test, we will send an image or have them set up an image for us and go from there. So really, there's no specific device for pen testing. It's really whatever you want. Hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so back to the phone base. So I can buy that acme.training. Now I have the email address and I can find their phone number somewhere. So there is a open source tool which costs money, but so not open source, but Spoof Card lets me spoof phone numbers. So I can just basically, I will call somebody, again, spoofing my phone number to look like it's coming from them, and then call an employee and immediately send an email once they pick up the phone. And that email will basically walk them through what I do on the phone. And I say, hey, this is Joe Smith from the IT department. We're in the process of setting up a new training portal. I need a few people from each department to make sure it's going to work properly before we roll it out. So do you have a minute to help me? And then I will basically have already sent the email. So that email will send them to https://www.acme.training. I will copy that web page. So There's a bunch of different tools where you can just manually do it to copy a website to make it look exactly like another login portal that your organization has. And then I will try to get them to log in. Now, when they log in, it'll basically scrape their password directly from that, give me their password. Now, after that, if I want to, I can send them to a compatibility page. This is one of my favorite things to do. And the compatibility page will basically, I like to go to just like Adobe Flash settings where you have the 3 pages of random gibberish that nobody ever reads about if your system's going to be compatible or not. And so I just copy that page. And then at the top, I'll add a link with a compatibility checker.exe executable. And I'll say, oh, don't worry about reading all of that. There's a compatibility checker we had that will make it really easy for you. Talk them into downloading it. Once they download it, I get full shell on their system, backdoor on their system. And then, from there I say, oh, great, I see it's compatible. Thanks for your help, and hang up. Now, the reason why that is so successful is 1, it looks like it's coming from the internal employee. And 2, because phone-based social engineering is actually our most successful. When we have somebody on the phone, your only choices there are to go along with it or to directly confront us, right? And nobody wants to be confrontational. So generally speaking, people just go along with it. I would say that that particular attack that I just laid out is successful 80 to 90% of the time, which is pretty scary if you think about it. Next would be spear phishing, and this is really just a tailored email trying to design them to fall for it. So I'm an example of a spear phish that we often do. So here's my silly diagram of really spear phishing is just trying to get a user to give us access to their computer, and therefore we have internal network access. Here's a spear phish example that we often use. So this one is basically we send job descriptions, and it poses a corporate recruiter, technical recruiter trying to hire people. So, good afternoon, I'm Elizabeth Overton with Direct Hire, an executive recruiting firm. I like to, what I call points of familiarity. I like to have things in here that makes people more likely to fall for it. So one of the things I do is you've been referred to me by several individuals, right? So that makes it look like, hey, I've already done my research and I know you. I also say, hey, even if you're perfectly happy at your position at Acme Corp, right? So if I list your company, that's another thing, but please at least be willing to consider the salary my client is, right? So now I'm saying, hey, if you open this email, I'm going to tell you your salary. Everybody wants to know their salary, right? So, so when you open that email, it basically, this is what it would look like. Obviously, this top part is I just literally copied and pasted from monster.com, a job I think is close to yours. And then I'll go through this and kind of take out anything that I think is too, specific. So I want it to, basically, I want you to be able to qualify for this so you think you have a chance. Now, down here at the bottom is the kicker. I say view salary. Now, everybody wants to know what they're worth or whatever. So when you enable macros and click view salary, all the user will see is, whatever it is. So for this, I'll try to find a competitive salary, whatever it is, $80K, depending on experience. And it'll show up in blue font there. So what I did is I have a custom macro I've written that A will change the text from white to blue in this box. So the text was there the whole time, but now it says 80,000 depending on, and then in the background it launches a reverse shell, which gives me complete access to their system. And now look, I have full access to that user's PC, and I can see, all the different stuff about their system. Generally speaking, from there, I like to take a few pictures with their webcam, and then hopefully use that later in a social engineering engagement, really to teach them what it is. So like I mentioned at the beginning of talking about social engineering, a lot of the times users are considering Prince of Nigeria and are not used to something more sophisticated like this. So if I can take these exact screenshots, and of course we anonymize them every time. I never want to reveal, who is vulnerable and who's not. But if I can, take this type of information and show it in a report or show it in awareness training, it's really going to, scare people into being better next time and to be more suspicious. And then we'll go through all the different ways why they may have been able to catch it, or all the different ways that I was trying to get past their security controls so that next time they're more suspicious and they can see it better going forward. So that's why I love to take pictures of those with a webcam and stuff, just to get them to do that. All right, checking real quick if there's any other questions. Nope, cool. Moving on, and I'll try to speed up a little bit here. Let's see where we are time-wise. About an hour. Okay. Wireless penetration test. So can a hacker break into my network from the parking lot, right? So generally speaking, in a wireless penetration test, that's exactly where I'm sitting to start with, or I might come into your conference room, but at some point I'm going to walk out to see how far your wireless access can extend beyond your building to show that this all can be done from outside your building, right? So that's the main risk is, can somebody on the floor above you, if you're in a multi-tenant building, or maybe the parking lot, gain access through your wireless networks exposed. Additionally, with a wireless penetration test, there's some elements of it that are tactical, like all the ones we've been talking about are completely tactical. Can I break in? There's also some aspects of wireless penetration test that have to be a little bit more audit in nature. So part of what we do is exactly what I said. Go out into the parking lot, see how far it extends, see if there's any strategies you can employ to try to get that not to. A lot of times it's not possible, just depending on how much glass is on your building, et cetera. You know, if you start turning down the access point power, you're going to run into compatibility issues. So sometimes you have to accept that risk and focus on the other vulnerabilities we find, but that's part of what we do. Other thing we do is we walk around the entire perimeter of the building as well as the interior hallways, and we're trying to find rogue access points. So really what this could be is something as benign as a printer still has their wireless turned on. The risk of that is obviously if I can gain access to that printer through the printer Wi-Fi and then somehow take over that printer, now I have a connection also to your internal network. What I've also seen a lot of times is users are bringing mobile hotspots or whatever from their home, which is perfectly fine as long as that's not also connected to your internal network. So sometimes I've seen organizations where they block CNN, ESPN, Facebook, the non-productivity type stuff, and now users are connecting to both networks simultaneously so that they can, you know, check their email and you know, go to Facebook or whatever. But because they're bridging those networks, it's a huge security risk that if I'm able to exploit that computer, I can now go over their weak access point to gain access to your secure access point. Additionally, if you're using WPA2, for example, or WPA in general, or please don't be using WEP, I can basically capture the pre-shared key. Now, there's different technologies are different ways. In general, for WPA2, which is the most common these days, essentially, if a client is initially accessing that network, there's a four-way handshake. As part of that four-way handshake, there is the encrypted key. And so I can take that offline and again do those 30 billion password guesses a second to try to gain access to it that way. Additionally, if you are using EAP or tying it to your Radius server so that basically everybody's authenticating with their own user account, again, that can be password sprayed just like anything else. And so maybe we'll do a password spray, try to gain access to your wireless that way. Another thing we do is try to gain access to the guest network, which 90% of the time they say, great, who cares? We're on my guest network, doesn't matter. Well, one of the things we want to make sure we're doing in a wireless penetration test is making sure that the segmentation is as planned. I just recently did a wireless penetration test against a major nonprofit organization that handles credit card payments, and they basically had a misconfiguration somewhere that basically allowed me to gain access to the guest network and then directly to the credit card environment, which was obviously not good. So that's one of the things we want to check. Web application penetration test is essentially is my web application secure? So the main difference in an external penetration test and a web application penetration test is in an external penetration test, I'm going to do, this first step here is basically, can an evil hacker dude gain access to my web app? And now in this example web app, just to help demonstrate the risk here, I have basically a teacher gradebook type application. And so this first one is basically, hey, can somebody gain unauthorized access, through the unauthenticated portions, find some sort of vulnerability that would give them unauthorized access. In this instance, in a web app penetration test, this first step we also do during external penetration tests. So if you remember back to the first one, we talked about an external penetration test. We're trying to gain unauthorized access to all the different systems in scope. So we are going to do that. But the difference is in a web application penetration test is we are also going to be testing all of the different authenticated portions of the website. So generally, we're going to ask for 2 sets of credentials for each user role. So again, sticking with this example, can student A see student B's data? Obviously, Joey shouldn't be able to see what Billy got on the grades, whatever it is, right? So can I see something that I'm not supposed to? Additionally, can Joey become the teacher and change his own grade? Of course, that would be very concerning. And then obviously, it would be even more concerning if Joey can become the principal and change his grade for every class he's in or whatever it is. Additionally, can the teacher see other teachers' data? Can the teacher see the principal's data, et cetera? And so one example of this is a web application test we recently did that basically, I just took a picture of the top breadcrumb bar of what I had access to. So you can see I had access to add, find, report, scout, pipeline. And one of the easiest ways to do this is something called a parameter tampering. So is there anywhere where I can identify all the different things, enumerate it, and then if I enumerate it, can I change it? So in this particular web application, there was this ID field that was used throughout all the different requests and responses I'm getting. And so one of them allowed me to enumerate all the different IDs in the system. So a lot of times on a web application penetration test, and including what we did here, is we are performing this penetration test against a development environment or a QA environment. So that's why you see a lot of fake names in here. In the real world, it might be actual usernames or something like that. So I can see ID 0 belongs to the system administrator, ID 1 belongs to a tech scout, ID 2 belongs to a SME role, ID 3, etc. And so what I did is I basically set a rule that every time I am sending my ID in a request, because that happened all over this website, I would send, hey, I'm ID this, I want to get, etc. I would just change my ID from whatever it was, 4 to 0. And because of that, I took over essentially the system administrator role. So great, did that. Let's parameter tamper, that's what that's called, and change my ID to ID 0 every time I see it, and refresh the page, and hello, now I have access to administer. Another thing we found with this exact same website is Sql Injection. So Sql Injection is one you've probably heard of before, but essentially it's basically if I can inject SQL commands into user input. So maybe the user input is to change my my first name in my account settings. Well, if I can do first name equals Joe, that's great. It's acting like it's supposed to. If I can do first name is Joe, semicolon, or / then obviously, and I get an error, well, now maybe we have SQL injection. So again, I'm just inserting SQL commands into that to see if I can get some sort of response. In this particular instance, it's a blind SQL injection. What that basically means to me is there's no error returned to me, but if I put in a Joe and then the SQL command for wait 20 seconds, the system takes 20 seconds to respond. If I can do the username Joe and the SQL wait command for 10 seconds and it comes back in 10, well, now I know it's vulnerable to SQL injection even though it's not telling me anything. So there's tools out there, this one's SQL Map, that can basically take that process for you, and it basically says, if it's an A, wait 1 second, if it's a B, wait 2 seconds, and then going off of the different response, it can retrieve all the different data from the database. In this particular instance, I'm enumerating the type of database being used, and then the screenshot on the right, here's test123, test2, tester. This is actually the passwords for the entire user table on this application. Now, obviously, I had to encrypt all those because this is from a real test, but now, guess what? That allows me to do offline password attacks. At least in this instance, they were encrypting it, but in a lot of instances, they don't. Again, offline password attacks, 30 billion password guesses per second. In very short time, I had 60% of all the users for this web application's password. Okay, moving on to one of the last ones. I think this is the last one. Physical penetration test. This is one of my personal favorite ones, but also one of the scariest ones. So this one is, can an attacker physically break into my building? So with that, there's basically a lot of different methods we use. I'll go over 3 of them real quick. My first and most common method of gaining access to a building is I will wait till lunchtime. And so usually I do a day of recon first to figure out exactly when users are entering and leaving the building, and kind of scout it out. What are the different entrances? What entrances are employees using? So really quickly I can find if nobody's using the side door, I'm willing to guess that is usually armed, so I don't want to use it. And I'll try to recon as much as I can. One of the things that we're hoping to do very soon is to get a drone, which we can do. And so very funny story with that is I was doing a physical penetration test against a scientific instrument company based out of Boston, Massachusetts. And I went up with one of my colleagues to do this physical penetration test. And one of the things we're doing is, hey, I'm going to gain access. And then they had this lunchroom on the side. And so I gained access to the system, and my colleague was supposed to come, and there was basically a white privacy fence that was about 6 feet tall, was the only thing protecting him. So I went into the lunchroom, gave him a call from my cell phone and said, hey, nobody else is in here. And he came in and was supposed to just casually jump over that fence as fast as he could and then just gain entrance that way. And now we can show the client there's 2 ways to gain access. Well, he jumped over the fence and ended up in some sort of bicycle storage rack that we didn't know was there. Because basically the way the fence was is the same white fence on both sides, and you can't tell there's actually something in between. So he was stuck in between there. So, obviously being able to do more recon with things like Google Map and drones would have helped us there for sure. But back to the box story. One of my favorite ways to try to break into a company is I'll sit out there at lunchtime, and I will be carrying a box, and I will pretend to be on my phone talking to somebody, and I'll wait till somebody leaves for lunch, and I'll say, hey, can you grab the door for me real quick? Right? And so everybody wants to be helpful, even up there in Boston, surprisingly enough. And also because you're on the phone, they don't really want to challenge you or bother you because obviously you're on an important phone call. So they just hold the door, you grab it, walk right in, nobody says a word to you. And even if they have second buyer's regret, you're on your phone so they can't talk to you. Second, and the most common, easiest way to gain access is this is known as a boss cloner. There's all sorts of variations of this, but basically this is a tool. The reason I like this is, you can see how big this thing is. That is essentially, the same Proxmark thing you use when you're trying to gain access to a parking garage or something like that. And so really that's meant to read your RFID card from, 3 or 4 feet away. What we will do is basically that is a tool made by Phil, that's close to Boss Cloner, I don't know, Bossler or something like that. Anyways, the Boss Cloner, you can slap it in a laptop bag like that and walk around, and I will try to get that device within a foot or so of somebody's RFID card. And so if I can, it clones the card to another RFID card I have present, and then boom, just like that, I have access to their key card. Usually I'll do that. Quick story of when I used that recently. I was in trying to gain access to a major insurance company. And so they basically have call centers all over the United States. And this particular one was in Dallas, Texas. And it was part of a giant, giant multi-tenant building with about, probably 6 companies, 8 companies within this, 4 or 5 story building. So, but the bathrooms, again, because the building company doesn't want to have 6 bathrooms per floor, were in common areas. So I just camped out in the bathroom and waited till somebody came to the restroom, and I picked the one obviously closest to their building, so I had a good chance of it being their employee. And I set that laptop bag on the sink. So when the user washed their hands, they had their RFID card sitting around their neck, and when they leaned over the sink, it leaned over my cloner device and stole their card. Left, got it, boom, got a little notification. It also sends a text message to your phone saying it copied. So I'm sitting there in the stall like, yes, got it. Then I take my laptop bag, casually walk to my car, make a clone of their car, and basically I just waited till evening when everybody left. Right around 5:30, I wanted most of the people out of the building, but not completely empty. Used their device, gained access to it, sat in a conference room, and took over the network, similar to the internal penetration test we did. So basically, that's the boss cloner. The final picture there, real quick, is a under the door tool. So obviously, in this instance, it's still on the same side of the door, but in an actual attack, you would flip that under the door, and it basically reaches around the handle and tries to pull it down like that. So physical penetration test, trying to physically gain access to the network. Red team engagement. So what is a red team engagement? Essentially, it's a time-capped assessment. So generally speaking, we like to try to make these 2 weeks long, and all of the methods are available to me. So everything we just talked about, physical, social, external, wireless, etc., are available to me, and I will go over, specific compromise goals that the client sets for me, or just general, can you gain access to our network, and if you can you elevate your access then? So all of my methods are available to me. The difference is I'm trying to avoid being detected in any way, shape, or form. So I'm not going to do things like run the vulnerability scan, because obviously that's going to give me away very quickly. Additionally, I'm going to try to do my most successful thing first that's least likely to catch me, and then slowly dive down from there. What that means is most likely I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the external network, because in general, most organizations are locking those down really good. Sure, I'm going to do those password sprays we talked about, but I'm probably not going to be enumerating every service across the network, at least not up front. I'm going to obviously be trying social engineering, password attacks, physically trying to break in, etc. And really I'm just trying to get as far as I can in that 2 week period while their incident response team is actively trying to stop me. What that means is, man, they caught my social engineering attack and they blocked my IP address. Great, let me spin up a new AWS host and launch a new social engineering attack. So obviously, the advantage for the client is, that can tell them if their incident response is working or not. Finally, obviously, really fun. Every pen tester that I know at least thinks red teams are definitely the most fun type of engagement. We love them. With that being said, they're definitely not for every client. A lot of times, as much as I'm kicking myself under the table, I have to talk my clients out of red team engagements. Why? Let's talk about it. The pros of red team engagements is they are the best way to evaluate your overall risk. If you want to know if your organization could be hacked or not, the best way to do that is to do a red team engagement. Why? Because one, my hands aren't tied as a pen tester. For example, in that external pen test with the multi-factor authentication I talked about where I called the help desk, in a lot of our external penetration tests, I wouldn't be allowed to do that without client permission unless social engineering is specifically part of the scope, right? Otherwise, I would have to reach out. My hands are tied. I'm only allowed to do the type of test that I'm authorized to do. The reason red team is the best way to evaluate the risk is because, obviously I am not tied with my hands behind the tech. Everything is available to me. And then two, you're not, in the second bullet here, you're not tied with your hands behind the back. In a actual penetration test, it's a collaborative type of assessment. I'm going to ask you not to block me. Again, I'm trying to be as loud as possible, launching all those vulnerability scans, hammering every door and knocking on every window to make sure I'm finding every possible way an attacker may be able to take advantage of your network or gain unauthorized access, etc. But in a red team engagement, you're actively trying to block me. So this is an effective way for you to see, hey, is my incident response process working? Can we actually stop an ongoing attack, etc.? Ultimately, can I sleep better at night? The reason why I have to talk a lot of clients out of it, though, is one, coverage. If I gain physical access through, an RFID clone and then connect my laptop to the internal network, well, great. Now I have access to the internal network. I'm going to try to escalate my privileges as much as possible. I am not, at that point, going to be running a vulnerability scan or doing an external penetration test, right? I already have access. Additionally, if I gain access through social engineering, I may not even come on site. So you might not get any aspect of the red team engagement that has to do with the physical security. You may not get any aspects of the red team engagement that has to do with wireless. Generally speaking, I'm going to find one way in and try to avoid detection and get as far as I can. So because of that, if you don't already have a secure, a mature security program in place, it's probably not the right type of test for you. Additionally, a red team is not going to meet a lot of the compliance requirements in place. So a lot of the regulatory bodies require annual penetration testing. So this could be, PCI, for example, requires an external and internal. A red team engagement, although it may consist of parts of an external and parts of an internal, because it doesn't have that full coverage, is not going to meet the compliance needs that you have in place. So with that being said, really fun to do as a tester, really great goal for you to get to as an organization, but unless you already have regular pen testing in place and know you're doing okay, it really doesn't make sense to do a red team. All right, last slide here, getting into penetration testing. So in general, at Triaxiom Security, when I'm conducting interviews, what I'm looking for is, one, prefer to hire people with some sort of experience. So now, that doesn't mean that you have to have penetration testing experience. In fact, usually I would prefer you not to have penetration test experience. That may sound crazy, but if you have penetration testing experience, then generally you've been taught by somebody how to do penetration testing, which if they taught you in a similar way to how we do penetration testing here at Triaxiom, great, I'm all for it. In general, though, there's a wide range of penetration testing companies. Some do little more than a vulnerability scan and call it a day. Some do, Rainbow Six operations or whatever. So because of that, I like to teach my engineers how to perform penetration testing myself, or at least per our methodology. So when I say prefer to hire somebody with some experience, generally what I'm talking about there is, I want you to have some sort of background in network operations center, or something where I know, hey, you know how a network works like the back of your hand, now I can teach you how to break it. Or I prefer you to be an app developer, and then I can train you really quickly how to do a web application penetration test. Have a background with how to develop web apps, coding experience, etc. And now you know exactly how an application works. It's easy for me to teach you how to break it. So generally, obviously, the best case would be a jack of all trades. That doesn't happen very much. So generally speaking, I prefer somebody with some type of experience out of somebody who, went to college and maybe has an InfoSec degree, but unfortunately doesn't have any back-to-hand or experience or knowledge of how it works. Now, that doesn't mean at all that I won't hire somebody straight out of college. It just means, generally speaking, I prefer some sort of experience. Real quick, in the penetration testing world, certifications are perhaps more important than even a master's degree, because really that's what our clients are looking for, how they're evaluating whether we know what we're doing. So because of that, really certifications are the most important. Really kind of in order here of importance, well, maybe besides CISSP, OSCP is one of the best you can possibly get. That to me proves that you know how to do penetration testing, although that's not really realistic. That's a separate conversation, but it's not really what a penetration test looks like. But it does tell me that you know how to troubleshoot, you know how to think through things, you know how to evaluate targets, etc. ECPVT, SAN's really expensive, but a good one is GPEN. And then on the lesser side, something like Security Plus or CEH would be fine. CISSP is a great one, but it's actually a terrible one to take, a terrible one to have. I don't like it, but it's the gold standard. If you are trying to get a job out, and your hiring manager doesn't know anything about security or anything about IT at all, they will know the CISSP, and that's the only one they'll know. And so really, I hate it, but that's kind of one that, in general, to be a security consultant, if you ever wanted to be on the audit side, you'd have to have. So it's definitely promising for a pen tester to have it too. Additionally, I'm looking for you to show passion and show commitment to learning. So what does that mean? Active involvement in local. In the interview, at some point, we're going to talk about, hey, tell me you're active in the local community. Are you attending talks like this one, etc.? Do you have a home lab at home? Are you doing hack the box, different things? Or, have you played in any CTF? Do you have a blog on it? Whatever. I need to see some sort of evidence that you have a passion for this type of thing. And a commitment to learning, because, in penetration testing, generally speaking, when I hire an engineer, I'll train them on one module, but my ultimate goal is for them to be qualified in all the different types of penetration testing we just talked about. So I need to be able to say that, you have a lifelong commitment to learning, and I need to see if you can show me some evidence of that, then obviously that's better. So, what does that mean? Either, education, comes first, and then you have a master's, you're constantly getting certifications once each year, there's some sort of commitment to learning. Because generally speaking, as a penetration tester, the environment is always changing. The vulnerabilities I'm facing generally are sometimes the same flavor of the same thing, but it's constantly changing. That's what makes it fun. But that also means that I need to be able to know that you are somebody who values education, somebody who is committed to constantly learning as the field evolves. Finally, public speaking. So you may perform this type of test, and then the next week you will be sitting in front of the CEO, the CISO, the whoever it is, CIO, and you have to be able to explain the results. So going back to that NDNS and LMR, you may have to show that exact diagram to somebody who is the head of a company who doesn't know anything about NDNS and explain it in a way that they can understand, and more importantly, in a way that they know what the risk is. So with that being said, you need to be able to present your findings, to provide advice, to be able to handle their questions, all in a professional manner. So public speaking, is obviously one of the things that we look for when we're hiring. All right, that was a lot. Hopefully that was helpful for you guys. Interested to hear any feedback, throw it in the chat. We do have 5 minutes for any questions, if anybody has any. Also, I will throw my email address now in the chat in case anybody has any questions they don't want for the whole group, and you can just email me separately. That's perfectly fine. But I'll hang out here for another 10 minutes or so just to answer questions if anybody has any. I am, however, going to turn my webcam off because you guys saw my ugly mug for long enough.
I think I see some questions in there, Matt.
Oh, thank you very much for pointing that out. Okay. Any advice for a fresh grad or newcomer that wishes to join CyberSec pen test specific? Yeah, so absolutely. Kind of talked about this in my last slide there, but first and foremost is get a job that gives you some sort of experience, whatever that looks like, either as a network operations center or a application developer, or being in charge of a SOC or anything that's going to give you hands-on keyboard experience in any way, shape, or form is going to be awesome. If you're trying to get into pen test specific, then you should be focused on something that gives you that kind of certification. So to show that certification-wise, the first starter one would be something like a certified ethical hacker is kind of an entry level, or the SANS GPen, which is a little bit more expensive, but same thing. And then really to show you're competitive for pen testing would be trying to get eventually the OSCP. So when you're trying to join, really keep applying. Some months at Triaxiom Security, for example, we are trying to hire really, like crazy, and we're having trouble hiring, and therefore, we'll take a chance on newcomers a lot more frequently. And other times, the hiring market is great, and so we're really selective with who we're hiring. Last time we tried to hire, we had 56 people apply for one position, so great position for us to be in. But it's different, in different seasons. So just keep working on making yourself more marketable and keep applying. All right, Luke asked, will this presentation be available for review later? So yes, it was recorded. I hope I did it right, Evelyn. And if so, yes, it is.
Yep, it's being recorded.
Okay, perfect. And the other questions were thanks. So if anybody else has any questions, I think we have, what, 7 more minutes left. So I'll hang out till the end of time. Feel free to answer questions or feel free to email me too if you want. Okay, another question here from Luke. How often do you do phishing attacks get stopped by spam filters? Great question. Depends on what they're using. One of the best out there is Mimecast. Is really I have a love-hate relationship with. So surprisingly, if we're trying to send bulk emails out to quite a bit, we get blocked quite a bit. And really, even if we're trying to do that one I said where we're setting up acme.training and we're trying to get past the email filters, a lot of times that'll get caught, you know, and mostly because it's from an unknown domain, or now, you know, spam filters are realizing, or phishing protections are realizing the fact that it's a domain similar to yours and they're blocking that, etc. One of the ways, though, we can get around that surprisingly has very little effect on whether our campaign is successful or not is if I'm, so what I will do is I'll basically send the email to 10 users, and if not a single one of those opens an email or clicks on a link or anything for, you know, 20 minutes, it's pretty safe to say it got blocked, right? And so when I run into something like that, all the spam filters and email filters in the world are really balancing that fine balance between trying to give you the most protection they can with not blocking legitimate emails. So by legitimate emails, if I copy and paste that exact same thing, hey, we're trying to set up a new portal, and I send it to you from my Gmail or from my Gmail account I just set up, that's, you know, user123@gmail.com, or I might do john.doe.acme.com@gmail.com, and I'll set up just a real quick, set up a free Gmail account to do that and send that. It will get past the spam filters 9 times out of 10, again, because it's just regular Gmail, and they're assuming wrongly that you will notice it's Gmail, and they're trying to not block legitimate emails. So in general, I'm getting blocked by spam filters more and more, but there's still ways around it. All right, with that, I'm guessing that's the last question, so I'm closing up shop. Thanks everybody for coming to listen to it. Again, my email's in the chat if you want to email me any questions about it, and I really enjoyed it. So have a great afternoon, everyone.